Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, submarines, Cold War spy secrets above and under the sea. And as we're going to get started with the introduction, let me share with you, I want you to think about submarines for a little bit. And think of submarines. What exactly are they? And vast number of people would say submarines are in the vision of what we saw, what I remember seeing during the movies. You know, one of the ones that stands out in my mind, submarine, on a major scale, was Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster, Run Silent, Run Deep. That was from my earlier years, and of course the second one is The Hunt for Red October. But the second one is a little bit more fictional. But anyway, we'll talk about different things about submarines. But again, I ask you to think back. How do you see submarines? What do you think they do? And we'll talk about that today. All the information I share with you is declassified. Not always easy to find, but it is out there in open sources. And I only share that information. Very careful when I receive information. I always make sure that I double back on it and make sure that it is declassified. I want to thank the Grand Princess, wonderful staff in the back and the front who helped me to put this together, and the Espionage during the Cold War. We are honoring the brave men and women who served, and those that lost their lives carrying out clandestine intelligence gathering operations. We remember what they did, how they did it, and why. And again, I'd like to share that we've been covering the two parts, the two first ones, what they did and how they did it. And as we're moving closer and closer to the end, we will continue to talk more about why they do it. Hope you had a wonderful time in Hawaii. I did as well. And as you can see, today is this one. We're going to go into these two sections where tomorrow's is submarines specifically, but they're sort of blended together because there's so much going on, not only in the oceans, but also in submarines themselves. I thank my network for a great deal of this information that I'm able to bring it to you, and individuals that I meet in different places at different times will also add more information that they'll never be mentioned, but they are out there helping to share information. We continue with your homework. Terms used in espionage, dry clean. Dry clean means action agents take to determine if they are under surveillance. That goes back to what I said originally to sort of build into today's topic. Spies do not spy. Spies find people who are willing to do the spying for them. I.e., we go, let's say, to East Germany, and we find East Germans that are willing to give up the secrets to someone who happens to be in East Germany that represents country, United States, or other countries. So they're retrieving information rather than obtaining it directly. They find secondary sources. But when you are in foreign countries, you're usually followed. Not 99% of the time, but you're followed. And there are all kinds of ways of trying to figure out, are you being followed? And it's quite extensive, and it can take actually days to drop someone behind you. It's very complex, and one of the great inventions in the world is you realize how many mirrors there are in the world. And you walk through places where there are constantly mirrors or reflections, and you use them extensively. So a lot of people say, boy, that guy's always looking at himself in the mirror. It's not that. It's doing other things. It's just constantly looking in mirrors or looking in reflections wherever they happen to be. So this is part of the action of dry cleaning. As we're going to move into espionage in the oceans, espionage in submarines and into other ships as well, I'd like to ask you again, from a different perspective, what is the primary map that you have in your head about the world? The primary map that you have in your world. Now, all of us went to school, And what many of us typically did is we sat in the classroom, consciously and unconsciously, and there was either a world map on the wall or there was a globe on, teachers' tables over on the side. And all through elementary and middle school, you went through this school and looking at these maps. And primarily what they focused on was the equator. Okay? That's what we saw. And that's quite typical worldwide. But in the espionage world, the map doesn't highlight the most important area on the globe. This is the area where World War II was almost fought, but it couldn't because there was an obstruction in the way. This is absolutely where Cold War, most of it is considered the most dangerous territory in the world. And to this moment, this is the center of where the highest probability of World War III is. This one area. This is the map of espionage. The North Pole, which is not an area that's typically looked at or studied very much. But it is the center. Why? Well, we'll cover some of the basics. Think of this as a clock, please. 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. Okay, the closest point between the United States and Russia is over the Arctic Ocean on a globe basis. Flat map is different, but on a global basis, it is the shortest distance. So if there was any airplane or missile attack, it was going to go right over the Arctic. Okay? These areas over here were, very close by, but there isn't much out here. So the most important areas, the most strategic point in the entire area of the Soviet Union, even though there are many, is this area right here. This island and this Murmansk. This is where most of the fleet is for the Atlantic, for the Soviet Union or Russia now. And this is where most of the atomic explosions took place. So we wanted to access this area through seafaring aspects. You also have to think of the time what did not exist, and that was satellites. They were very primitive, very new, and they didn't exist. So being in the Arctic, finding ways of being there and finding ways to be closer in proximity to each other so that we could monitor what their activity was, that was critical. That was the beginning of the Cold War. How can we find out what they're doing? We were interested in other areas throughout the Soviet Union because they were shooting missiles at a lot of times in practice. But we were also looking for the missiles that they tested out of here that would drop into the ocean. We would try to pick up the pieces and then analyze it. One of the critical points about the Arctic Circle is that in the Arctic, things are not firm. There is no land underneath the ice sheet. And then to make things more complicated, especially when you're navigating through this area, through space or through on Earth, is that the North Pole moves. It is not stagnant. You have magnetic north, you have geographic north, you have north geomagnetic poles, and essentially the North Pole is moving. This is a map of where it's gone. It's moved 32 miles this year, and eventually it'll continue onward to the right. So we think we see a globe on the desk of a teacher, and we see it firm, but in fact, it's actually moving. It's rotating. It's moving along. And the South Pole moves also in consequence. It throws satellites off. It throws machinery off. It's, gauging things. And then on top of that, you add the weather, you add the climate, you add the space weather, which is a new concept. You add all these components, and then trying to get into the Arctic and trying to approach the Soviet Union is a very, very dangerous activity, very complex. And again, here's a little bit more information. Now, I don't want to get too technical on the area of how the North and South Poles move. In order to make sense of the different layers of espionage that deal with the oceans, we have to look at some of the classifications. What you typically see, and it's very common to see, it's top secret. And it is. It's secret, and it's, considered important. But unfortunately, that's overused. There's somebody down here somewhere with a stamp, and they go, and they're stamping everything top secret. After a while, you don't know what really is top secret or not. It seems like, certain clothing requirements is top secret, and they nail it. So I've seen people where they're just, what are you stamping? I don't know. They gave me a stack of papers, so I just stamped it. Okay, but it's still secret. Then you go to the next tier up, ultra top secret. Okay, and it's classified. You don't see this very often. But it's out there, it's classified ultra. Now you're getting into a smaller circle of people. Now you pay attention to it. You can't just ignore it like a regular paper was top secret. There are 2 levels higher than that. When you get to level 2, you better pay attention what the heck's going on. When it says top secret and there's a code name after that, you better know, you better sit down and read every sentence of that and memorize it and forget that you ever read it. That's almost as high as you can go. The circle of a code name, top secret, is defined as being maybe no more than maybe 3,000-4,000 people on the planet knows that it exists. It can be more or less depending on the project. But whenever you see anywhere on a piece of paper or you're reading in your books on espionage, you say top secret and it's got a name after it, it's something very, very important. And then the next level, the highest level of all, nobody knows what it is. I mean, come on, give me a break. You want an ultra secret, you want to know what the name of it is. That's not a secret. Actually, there were some documents during World War II, they were so highly regarded as being ultimate secret. They were going only to Churchill and to FDR, and Stalin, as a matter of fact, it was so secret that they put no label on it. They figured if it was lost and somebody picked it up, there was nothing that said secret on it, and people would ignore it. That's how high secret it was. So this gets into a very blurry area. However, sometimes they do say ultra high secret, and they'll disclose what the name is. So you'll see these categories. You pay attention to the movies and the books, you'll start seeing these categories, so you know what you're looking at. Continents, countries that have nuclear power submarines. Forgive me for having a map so little. This one didn't work for me. But UK, France, India, China, United States. There are some countries that also have submarines. Argentina, they just lost one about 2 years ago. Israel is common to have 1 or 2 submarines themselves. Are they nuclear? I still don't know that information. So they're not really the only ones that have it, but they are the ones that have the majority. How did they get a hold of it? Oh, North Korea. I'm sorry, that's the other one, North Korea. How did they get hold of them? Well, countries use them, they get old, and they sell them out in the open market. Okay? And countries buy them. And they're very, very old, but they don't, they use them in a whole different way. But obviously, they don't always know how to maintain them. And the story of the Argentinians dying recently, and one of them is one of the stories. And the Indians have had a couple of problems with their submarines as well. Most of them are usually still diesel. Nuclear, probably only Israel, but that's not confirmed. Anyway, this is an old number of submarines. It changes a great deal. There's always a discussion whether the United States is in a missile gap category with other countries. And I've seen these reports on common newspaper, do we have a missile gap? Do we have a submarine gap? Well, the answer is yes and no. On one hand, our current number, the last time I checked with, we're down to 58 submarines. A lot of them have been decommissioned, they're very old. The cores, the nuclear core reactors can survive up to 30 years, so they don't have to be maintained constantly, they don't need that kind of issue. But the way it's explained is this way. Whenever you talk about submarines against the Russians, you have to look at the United States plus the French submarines, plus the UK submarines. So our allies are included in the number. If we just look only at the United States, then we say, well, there's only 58 and the Russians have more. The second thing is that our submarines, non-Russian, are built very high-ended, high quality. The Russians have always built more of everything, but the quality has always suffered. But they're not concerned about that. That's not their big concern, to be a quality machinery. They're concerned to outnumber. Even if they're noisier than heck, they rather have 50 noisy ones than have 10 very silent ones. So it's a difference of number and opinion. But because of our allies, we have a dominance over the Soviet Union. But now we have another player, the Chinese. And don't get too much into the Chinese because that's really a new number and that's a whole new factor. But submarines are critical. Now, let me share with you to answer a question I presented at the very beginning. Submarines during World War II were pretty much hunters. They went out, they saw a target, they shot a torpedo, blew it up. Very straightforward for the most part. And that came out of, obviously, World War I, where the Germans, World War I, started using submarines in a warfare attitude. After World War II, there was a question come up. It says, well, we're not going to be out in the oceans shooting each other anymore, at least hopefully not again, because now we're talking nuclear. Nuclear torpedoes, nuclear missiles on the ships. So what happens to the submarine world? Well, they changed it. And what they did is they broke it up into different categories. There are some submarines that basically all they do is carry missile silos, and they're only in preparation to launch their missiles. They do other things, but that's primarily what they do, is they're running around the ocean, trying to be stealthy, not to be seen, and preparing, if they need to get up to the surface and launch their missiles. There are other kinds of submarines that go around hunting the submarines that have the silos. Okay? Their job is to stay near them and be able to blow them up before they would be able to launch. So there's a different category for that. Then there's a third category of espionage where they carry very little armament, if you will, but they carry personnel and special equipment in order to retrieve information and material from different parts of the world to maintain a sense of espionage. And then there are smaller version submarines where they actually carry personnel. It could basically be the Navy SEALs or other people, and be able to get them in and out of places that are normally inaccessible, i.e. around the Arctic area. So there's a lot of different kinds of submarines doing different projects. You have to look at it and understand that area as well. Now, we go back to Cold War, and we had a problem. We knew that the Arctic we had to enter the Arctic somehow, but we didn't know how. We didn't have the technology of the time until someone says, I can build a submarine that can go under the Arctic ice, and we're very grateful to Admiral Rickover. Most of the time when you read his history, his bio, and his bio is about that big, there's a book out on it, and just read it twice. Most of the time, most of the people didn't like him. They really dislike Rickover. They disliked his attitude. They disliked the way he did things. They disliked the fact that he was just a perfectionist, if you will. But he knew what he wanted out of this project. He wanted a fail-safe nuclear submarine that nothing would go wrong with it. And he just constantly were on top of people and engineers, expecting them to come up to the highest level quality possible. And he set the motion of what's supposed to be. And he also rated other budgets of other projects that were ongoing, and people didn't like it, but he said, I need this money for my project. And he was able to come up with the USS Nautilus Ascent. So the Nautilus was the one that he was going to use. And think about it. We're going to put a nuclear submarine under the ocean, under the ice, in an area we have never entered. Nothing had ever gone into the Arctic area under the ice pack. And this is their symbol. Somebody sent it to me. They had it, and I really enjoyed it. The whole idea of being under the ice when you don't know how thick the ice is above you, you don't know where the floor is, and be able to transpose around, moving around, with an area with 30 feet clearance above you and 20 feet clearance below you. And you can go into an area where you could be locked in, where you can't get out in terms that the ice is moving, it's shifting. Above the ice is storms. The ice in the Arctic rotates clockwise. So it's never stable, so you can't go back through the same place twice because it's probably not there any longer. And the thickness of the ice varies from season to season. So the whole idea that someone could go from one side to the other under the Arctic ice and never having done it, it was really a major task. And then to be able that you have no safety factors involved, whereas if something goes inside the ship, whether it be a fire or some mechanical breakdown, A, there's no one else to come and rescue you, and B, you can't break through the ice, it's too thick. So everything was working against it, but it was still able to do it. So it was a master achievement that stated the technology of the United States at that time. One of the projects was top secret IV belts. Okay, you know what you're looking at now. Again, as I shared earlier, and it is in all your major books on espionage in this area, it's again the island, the explosions. The biggest nuclear explosion test in the world was done by the Russians. It was a 55 megaton bomb. Khrushchev wanted 100, and his scientists were actually afraid of creating it. They could have, but they talked them down to half, to 50. And apparently it was so powerful that it blew out windows out in Sweden and Finland. They never talked about what had happened in here. They wanted submarines in here to see the test site, and they did accomplish that. So you can imagine being underwater and all of a sudden feeling the current of the shock of the explosion itself to be anywhere near there. Of course, the Russians are looking for you as well. You're being hunted all the time that you're in the neighborhood. But this was the area that constantly wanted to have foreign submarine activity inside Soviet waters as well. So this area, okay, it's not in here. The USS Halibut is one example of how submarines started to shift in terms of what their missions were. The original point of the Halibut was to create a test site where they could take out missiles, put them on the top, and then ship them from here. That was the idea of the ballistic missile concept. But something happened. They changed the format of the ship, and they created this particular portion in the back of it. And no one knew what it was. And there was also what other parts under the ship in various forms. They put sleds, railing sleds, under the submarine, but you could never see them. And people always wondered, especially in the Navy, what was this cavity for? What does it do? But they would never share what it was going on. This is another picture, sort of giving you a general picture of it. And this ultimately is what happened. This was a special place where they could put in frogmen at a very special temperature with special oxygen, special air, and they would stay there and be compressed, and the decompression and compression happened inside. And the reason for this is this portion here, it shows that this piece would break off and go off on its own. Well, in essence, the idea was that this portion of it was not to be disengaged. It was permanently part of the hull. It had never been done before. This is the area of the designation of what it was for. This project was ultra secret. Ultra secret. And what happened is they found out that they could find a cable of telephone between 2 points. Okay? Between two headquarters of the Russian naval section, and be able to come down, find the cable, and be able to extract the information that was going through the cable without the Russians knowing this. so that we could listen in. This was very new, old technology, new at the time, old to us today. What primarily it does is does not break the cable. You put a mechanism next to it, and it records what the information was. That was the old technology where you put it right next to the cable, it recorded the messages that were flowing in and out. Another submarine had to come back in a certain amount of time, grab the unit, take it back to the mainland, and they would put in a new one. And they could only record. So we were listening into their conversation at the highest level of naval activity, but it was old information. It could be 2-3 months old. Valuable at that time, but it lost its value because of the time factor. But nevertheless, at the very beginning, we were able to tap the information. Now this gets, seems like it's a historic point, but it builds up to something in the present as well. It was very, very dangerous work. Submen were always working in frigid waters. They had to run special heat cables to be able to heat up their suits in here so that they would be able to stay warm. And they were always in constant danger. The submarine was in constant danger of being discovered. That happened several times where they almost did. They had certain problems sometimes in the submarines where they almost had to leave and abandon the frogmen outside because they were having technical problems inside the submarines. It was exceedingly, exceedingly dangerous. However, there's a history that goes into today with this. This is a model of what one of them that looked like. And if you ever want to see the one that was originally used at that time, there were multiple ones. It was the idea that you can go to the Soviet Moscow Military Museum and you can see it there. Eventually, they knew that it was there. There was a U.S. Navy personnel that told them that we had tapped their communication. They continued to dialogue using the same phone line, but all of it was make-believe. Why do I mention this? What is so critical about this? Well, here's a question for you. In the present day, have you asked yourself the question, is your information private? Okay? Have you wondered that question? Is it against the law? People have asked me several times on this ship. Is it against the law for someone to tap your phone, tap your information, tap your internet? Well, I'm going to share with you the information of the answer to that question. This is an old map, but it gives a basic idea of phone and internet lines throughout the world. Okay? So, if a country wanted to tap the cable, do they have places to tap it? Yes. There's millions of miles of cable on the ocean floor. Now, don't quote me on this, but I think if there's someone here technically can give me the answer correctly. But last time I heard, Google main computer frame is in Iceland. Not typically only in one place, but it's usually in several places. But Iceland is one of them, which means that if I'm talking to you, okay, and you're sitting right next to me, and I happen to be texting to you, and I'm going through Google, you or I have Gmail, my message goes through a series of cables, it ends up in Iceland, and then it's shipped back to me. So my message, even though you're sitting right next to me, may go around the world several times before it comes back to you sitting right next to me. And since it's going through all this cable and information, it can be tapped anywhere in the world. So even if we made a law and says we will not tap the information in the United States, it doesn't really matter because all the cables are laying out in the ocean. We can go and tap them even today. Some of the information now, we have satellites and we're using them as well, but this sort of answers the question that from that moment, from the moment we discovered that we can extract information out of the cables, the world is open. Everything can be accessed. accessed through the cables throughout the world. There is no privacy, not through this system. The Navy divers are very special people because these people, a lot of their work has been super secret. It's been kept quiet, and for reasons of protection, not only of them. I happened to meet one in Bermuda. He was an ex-U.S. Navy diver. He was built like a rock. He was an old-timer, but he had stories to tell. He kept them sort of quiet and open. But all their work was dangerous. Being in a submarine 24/7 for 6 months, I can't think of anything more dangerous than that, because if it's not someone else is trying to shoot you, you have all the pressure of the oceans trying to do you in, and then trying to prevent crashing into each other, and someone's got you in their sights and you're in somebody else's sights, and you're trying to hide from them and trying to hide from, they're hiding from you. And then they follow one basic rule. Noisy submarines are dead submarines. So, but then on top of that, you get into the water. A lot of their work is a lot of times inspection or accessing cables or moving machinery underneath. As you can see, they're built with a lot of equipment. This is very deep water equipment, not your typical just scuba diver for recreation. And then there's a great deal of super secret information for diving as well in the espionage world. To talk more about espionage and the oceans, I bring this topic up about the Pueblo. The USS Pueblo is the only ship that is still in captivity that's considered active ship. Okay? And I happen to have the honor 2 cruises ago to have met Edward Murphy. He's Lieutenant Commander. He is the only living person from the captured USS Pueblo. He is in really bad physical shape. The torture took a toll in his body, but he was on one of the cruise ships. I happened to meet with him several times. This is a picture of the North Koreans boarding the USS Pueblo. As you can see, it's super fuzzy. It's fuzzy intentionally. It's actually extreme opposite. It's extraordinarily clear. But whenever they take a picture, especially this one from SR-71, or at that time it was called the A-12, they purposely make them fuzzy for the public vision. They say, well, here we see. They say probable, but they know what they're looking at as well. So the whole idea is, how did this happen? As you may have remembered, because some people wanted to go to war, atomic nuclear war, over the Pueblo. And the idea is that no one in the Navy really thought that anyone would ever board a U.S. spy ship. And it was just unfathomable that anyone would even want to. However, it had no armament. They had a few rifles and a little, measly guns. And they were all traveling at the speed of a tugboat. They weren't going anywhere fast. So once the North Vietnamese decided to board the ship, there really wasn't very much they could do. A lot of equipment, a lot of spy equipment eventually was removed from the ship and sent to Moscow, and they broke into a lot of our codes. And since they had recorded a lot of the messages that were ongoing before invading the Pueblo, they were able to go back and decipher the messages because they kept them in file. So the damage was huge, tremendous. And they blamed the ship for not doing something or sinking itself. However, thanks to Lieutenant Commander Murphy, he shared with me that the ship, the Pueblo, was ordered to go back out at sea, and they did not have thermite on the ship yet. It was one day delayed, and they left without it. Thermite is, I think of it as a substance that's made out of aluminum, a form of aluminum, that if you ignite it, it gets super hot. They have a special room where they throw all the papers in there, all the secret material, they throw it in there, light up the thermite, and it just burns at very intense heat. Well, they left without it. Okay, so since they had all the idea that they were going to be aborted, they tried to burn everything, but it was a slow process and they couldn't do it. So by the time they were boarded, there was still a lot of material to take on. So whose mistake it was, it's a lot of finger pointing, but that's essentially why they could not get rid of all the material that was on the ship. It's too much of it. This is an interesting ship. This was a very old little ship that was converted over, and it was used in different parts of the world, but it became very important during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what made this one little tiny boat so special was this was the very first ship that could take a message and bounce it off the moon. Send it to the moon, and they would bounce it, and they would land in Washington, D.C. Never been done before. So the whole idea was that they discovered that if you put a certain amount of radar, simplify it, radar on the moon, messages that were going on in the Soviet Union were floating up into space, bouncing off the moon, and coming back toward Earth. And we were listening to it. So now the moon was part of the espionage world, thanks to the Oxford. And it was used during missile crisis. This, going back to the Pueblo, this picture came out. I don't know if you noticed the fingers. They're in a very interesting position. The North Koreans did not know what that meant. Okay? These were the pictures that were sent back to the United States to show them that they were still alive. However, because of what they had done, by the time the North Koreans found out, these men got tortured. They didn't die, but they did suffer. They were tortured. And this is the ship. Even today, it is in North Korea. It can be visited as part of the museum. So it's still there. Next project. Project Azorium. You may have heard of this one. There is a lot of controversy about this ship. Even today, I saw a program about a month ago where they were still debating the value of this project, well, because of the expense of it. The CIA went over to Hughes Corporation and said, we want you to build us a ship that will be able to extract a submarine that's laying at the bottom, I think it's almost 3 miles, and bring it up to the surface without anybody knowing that you did that. We were stealing a Russian ship. So the idea was that they created the technology, they created a special ship, and they did have claws that went down at the bottom. The discussion was, A, the CIA had spent billions of dollars on it. B, they said, you know, getting the sub is important. It does have equipment in there that we want. It does have codes, but it's a very old ship. A, it may break up on the way up, and B, a lot of the information, both technical and metallurgical, is really outdated. We don't really need it. But they went ahead with the project anyway, so the full decision-making of why they did it is still up in arms. But they did find the ship. They did know where it was, even though the Russians had no clue where they were, and they wanted it to look like they were exploring for oil or magnum cores, things that are at the bottom of the ocean, that they were mostly doing something else. They were not going to bring up a submarine. But they did. It did break up on the way up. They only brought up a portion of the ship, and a lot of technical things had to happen in order to preserve the material once it was exposed to the open air. So they brought it back. They did find some remains of the Russian sailors. They had a ceremony, a burial ceremony, secret of course, for them. And recently the Russians were given the tape where they were acknowledged and had a full burial ceremony in the ship when they brought up the submarine. So still, even today, they're still debating the value of doing this. But it did prove once again the technology, the ability to bring up something from something that was considered almost impossible, to bring up a sub from the bottom. Then what happened is the subs started to get the Polaris missile on it. They were able to be launching platforms for missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles, and now ballistic missiles. And that changed the program of the submarines again. Now, like I said, there were diverse amounts, doing different activities, and these were the more dangerous ones of them all because they carried the nuclear missiles. They had to be the primary target, and they're the ones that when they're out in the ocean, they're usually pursued and followed 24/7. So they have to have all kinds of tricks and ways of avoiding detection, because if war broke out, they would be the first ones to be shot at because they're carrying the missiles in them. So this is the area of danger that there's always persists in this world of espionage and under the oceans. This is one of my favorite pictures. Have any of you ever seen this particular ship? Anybody? No? This is in Tahiti. This is a Chinese spy ship. It was sitting right next to us. I was on a princess ship. We docked in port, and I looked over and I thought, oh my God, you know. As long as there is no nuclear material on the ship, they can dock in Australia, they can dock in Tahiti, they can dock in many areas. Not in the United States, but they can dock. And what started to happen, and I laughed because I had this one lady came up to me, and she kept insisting, I kept saying, this is a spy ship. She says, people tell me it's a fishing boat. I said, ma'am, how did you come to that conclusion? I said, okay, if you think it's okay, that's fine. If it's a fishing trawler, I can tell you with super certainty, that the Chinese love Heineken beer. Because the entire day, they did nothing but load up beer all day long. Those guys can drink up a lot. The ship we were on left port and had to sit outside of port almost 3 hours. And people say, how come we're sitting out here? The captain never came online. And I shared, and my theory is that they had to reboot all their computers over again. Because this ship was not there to spy on us, okay? We just happened to be next to it. And it's like a giant magnet. It's always on. It's always capturing, information and electronic activity. So it captures everything, especially if you're sitting right next to it. I had some people come up with their cell phones, and everything was in Chinese. Everything had switched over. And people were just freaking out. They thought, oh my God. I said, you're not a person of interest. Don't worry. You retired years ago from, I don't know, being a bartender. Don't worry about it. They're not after your information. I said, but they may enjoy your pictures a little bit because it's now in their computers. But on top of this is mainly, they use these, now there's 7 of them worldwide. They use these mainly for launching their cosmonauts and launching their missiles. But when they're not being in use, these are sub-hunters. Okay? All the bottom of the ship is special equipment just to hunt submarines. They've got to do something. They can't just be, they're not always in space activity. So they have multiple uses as well. Tomorrow I'll show you a different spy ship in the Philippines, which also was there. And I happen to be very proud of seeing this particular unit. The Avalon, I caught it over in Morro Bay. Somebody told me it was there. And it is a rescue vehicle, primarily to rescue personnel. If there was trouble in the submarine, it can be flown anywhere in the world instantly. And if you remember, there was a story recently where the Russians had a problem where one of their subs was going down in the Norwegian waters. And we volunteered to send the sub over and rescue their personnel, and they declined the offer, and they allowed their members to die. They really have no safety factor for their submarines. Again, they're into quantity, not necessarily into quality. So that became a big issue that, of course, the Russians didn't want us being inside their subs and taking pictures of what was in there, which we would have, but nevertheless, they allowed their crew to die. And those are the tragedies that happen to be confronting for individuals that are in the world. So that pretty much ends today. I ran out of time. I'm not showing the video today. I'll move it to tomorrow. And tomorrow we'll continue with the conversation of top secret spy missions in the Pacific, subs, and others. I will be down at the bottom of the 6th floor to answer any questions. Thank you for being here today, this morning. Thank you.